This summer I upgraded my camcorder from this HD camcorder to this 4K camcorder. They're both made by JVC. Essentially, this one is the many times upgraded version of this one. And besides being 4K, there are clearly a bunch of other differences between these two camcorders, and I thought it would be a really good thing to do a bit of a comparison and review for anybody else considering upgrading from one of these camcorders to the other, or for that matter looking at camcorders in general, because a lot of the comments I have about the upgraded one would really apply to similar camcorders from other brands. This one here, the old one, is the JVC GY-HM100U, the U meaning it's meant for North America with 30/60 Hertz type frame rates for video. There is an E version that is meant for Europe and other countries that use those types of TV standards with 25 or 50 type frame rates. Anyway, that shouldn't make any difference for the purposes of my comments. It is perhaps worth mentioning these are both mobile professional type camcorders, so they're not consumer ones. They're really amongst the smallest of the professional camcorders and have a lot of the standard professional features, which I'll talk about briefly. So with that in mind, I should also point out that this is from the perspective of somebody who does YouTube videos, where I am the entire production team as well as the talent. So that sort of sets the tone as to what I expect from a camcorder and how important it is for me to have a camcorder that makes recording as easy as possible. It's also worth pointing out that I am an engineer, so there's a bit of an engineering perspective in all of this, particularly when I look at the ergonomics. And for that matter, besides being a videographer, I'm also a still photographer, and I will sort of bring some of that perspective in the comparisons as well. So maybe we should talk about what's a pro camcorder. Probably the most distinguishing feature between pro camcorders and consumer camcorders is the wealth of manual controls that pro camcorders have. Most notably, you typically have access to manual focus, manual zoom, manual iris, and manual shutter speeds, as well as white balance, and maybe most important of all, manual audio settings. And you might be wondering, why is that professional and so important? Well, even though the automatic controls on all our cameras and camcorders today are really amazingly good, they're not perfect, and you often see things like the focus hunting when it's not really sure what you're trying to take a picture of, or you might find that when nobody's talking, the audio starts getting very noisy because the camera goes, I don't hear anything, I better crank up the gain. And for that matter, if you're panning and you're panning past something like a window, well, if the window's bright, the camera will see the extra light and go, this is extremely bright, I better turn down the sensitivity. And when it does that, well, suddenly everybody in the scene looks like a silhouette. So if you have manual control of all of these things, it takes a little bit more effort, but you can generally get a better and more stable picture. So that's perhaps one of the key characteristics. The other one is professional camcorders generally have professional audio interfaces, namely an XLR connector or two. And well, one of the advantages is they're rugged. Another one is it's differential audio, so if you have a long cable to a distant microphone, you're less likely to pick up hum. And all the professional microphones typically have an XLR connector or something that easily converts to it. And finally, there's phantom power. In other words, the camera can provide power to the microphone, which in many cases is important. A good example is this microphone, which does need phantom power to work. So that's what a professional camera or camcorder is. And maybe what we should do is briefly talk about the major differences between these two. The key one, of course, and the reason I upgraded, was the new one has 4K type resolution. This one has 1920 by 1080 HD type resolution. And with that, of course, the new one is slightly bigger, slightly thicker more than anything else, to hold all that additional circuitry, and slightly larger image sensors, and obviously slightly larger lenses for those sensors. This one came out in 2010, and at that time HD would have been the absolute cutting edge of technology. This one came out in 2018, where 4K was the cutting edge technology. However, it's still being produced and it's being continually enhanced in software, so you can buy them new, and if you have an old one like this one, well, you can upgrade it to the latest greatest software and capabilities. So that's rather nice. Pricing, well, when this was new, it was almost $3,000. Now you can pretty much pick them up for around $500. A really good deal for the amount of technology and capability you're getting. Having said that, it'll of course depend on when you're viewing this video, because if you look at it in 20 years, well, you can either get these things for $50 at that point, or maybe $5,000 if for some reason they became collector's items. So it is a very time-dependent thing. This camcorder, I believe, has a manufacturer's suggested retail price of around $2,600, and I should say all of these are US dollars. You can typically pick up a used one probably for around $1,500, and there are also a few specialized variants of these that perhaps cost a little bit more, as well as a few scaled down versions, which I'll mention later, that are a bit less expensive. So that's the general nature of these two camcorders, and I think what we should do now is talk about the specific differences, and we'll start off with the ergonomics, which besides the 4K part is really one of the key differences. Perhaps the biggest difference is the size of all the controls on this camcorder are bigger than on the older one, and that's partly possible just because the camcorder's body itself is bigger. And it turns out that's very convenient when you're trying to find buttons, particularly in a dark room or in a dark lighting situation. There are a few extra controls as well. The one that I use all the time is this knob here, which allows me to adjust the iris to manually set the amount of brightness in the image. The old camcorder had, well, a switch on the back here, or a couple of switches that you could twiddle and do the same sort of setting. The thing about that is, of course, you have to look at those switches to find them because they are so small, whereas on this one, if you know where the knob is, well, you can almost do it without thinking. The other significant difference on this camcorder is it has two control rings around the lens. One is typically set for zooming, the other is set for focus, and having those there makes it way easier to do precise zooming, whereas on the other camcorder you pretty much had to rely on the zoom control levers, which are very good for controlled zooms, but not necessarily if you want to do something a little fancy. You could, of course, set the other one's sole control ring to do zooming, but then you wouldn't have it for focusing, and that would be a real loss because the ability to manually focus is really quite critical. Perhaps one interesting addition that this has that I wasn't expecting or expecting to be that useful is not only does it have the record button where your thumb is, but it has another one up on top of the handle. And I found when I've got the camcorder on a tripod and it's sitting here, or maybe I've got it focused at the workbench, and I want to start recording, it's often way easier to just reach down and touch that button as opposed to trying to find this one if you're not holding it with your hand. In fact, you can sort of see me hunting around for it right now. Similarly, the zoom controls here are also available up here. Again, a great convenience when you just want to quickly zoom in or zoom out a bit and don't want to try and reach over here. Another feature, or maybe ergonomic change, is the on-off buttons, which, well, on this camcorder are over here near the record button, but on the newer one are on the side here. And having the on-off button here is way more convenient than having it right near the record button, because at times when you're hunting for it here, you can accidentally hit the record button on the older camcorder. Having it over here, well, typically you've got it switched on or you've got it switched off, and you're less likely to accidentally flip it when you're not intending to, even though both of them have a little latch in the middle to make that even less likely. Perhaps the big difference between these two camcorders is remote control. The old HD camcorder has a TV style infrared remote control, and well, it has numerous functions on it, but the ones that I always used were the record and stop recording button and the telephoto and wide zoom control buttons. And if you're wondering how that could be useful when you can't see what the camcorder is looking at, well, it has this screen that you can tilt towards the front, and so if I have the camcorder videoing me, I can see what I'm capturing and adjust the zoom accordingly, at least if the camera is not too far away. And I found that extremely convenient. There's nothing like a real button in particular to turn recording on and off at a distance, well, when I'm doing something like sitting here. Now, the new camcorder does not have the IR remote, and that's probably the one thing that I really miss on it. Instead, what it has is a wireless or LAN remote where you can access this camcorder and many of its controls through a web browser interface. And I usually do that with my cell phone set in hotspot mode, where I've got this camcorder connected to the cell phone, and not only do I have controls like zoom and like record on and off, but also iris and shutter, and on top of that I can also see a live image of what this camera is capturing, and that can be really useful if the camera is a little bit far away. Even though its screen is bigger than the older camcorders, it's still pretty small if the camcorder is, well, maybe 10 feet from me. So that's a really nice feature. The downside is, because of course all the buttons on the cell phone or on the web interface are touchscreen buttons, well, they're a lot more awkward to use than just reaching for a control like this and almost without thinking pressing record. So you get some good and you lose something good in that change. Now, the other great feature that this camcorder has is it has a connector on the back for a LANK control. LANK is an electronic control standard used by many cameras and camcorders, and what that means is when I have this on a tripod, I can attach the camcorder to an external controller that's on one of the arms on the tripod, and that can be way more convenient. And the added bonus is you don't get any sort of shaking of the camera when you're zooming in or zooming out as you would when you touch these automatic zoom buttons that are right on the camera. So that's an absolutely great feature, and certainly was one of the selling points of the camera to me. There were a couple of unexpected differences between these two cameras where this one really shines. The first one is the battery. The battery on the new camera is way larger than the battery on the old camera. In fact, way more than just proportional in size. And what that essentially means is on the old camera, the battery time was probably an hour and a half. On this thing, it is, well, so long that I've never actually ran out of battery or gotten close to it. The other difference is the SD cards. Now, on the old camcorder, as was the standard at the time, the maximum capacity of the cards was 32 gigs. So with two 32 gig cards, this camcorder probably had about 3 hours of recording time on blank cards. Well, this one here I think is limited entirely by the size of the SD cards. I have two 256 gig cards in it, and I think that produces a recording time of something in the 8 or more hours at 4K type resolution. And once again, that is so much that I never have to worry about potentially filling up the cards or anything like that. In fact, I end up doing 2 or 3 or 4 shoots before I even bother erasing the cards. So they're so big they actually act a bit like a backup to my video in case the computer were to crash. You could certainly put bigger SD cards in it. I've found right now 256 gigs is about the sweet spot in terms of pricing. They typically cost 40 or 50 bucks or less on sale. And the other feeling I have is if you have much bigger cards, well, then there is the risk if something goes wrong with the card, you end up losing significant amounts of data. So bigger isn't always better either. Now, there were a couple of things that, well, the old camcorder is way better than the new one. The smallest and perhaps most insignificant is the old camcorder has a built-in lens cap that you activate with a lever right on the built-in lens cover. Well, that is so convenient, it's unbelievable. On the new camcorder, you have a conventional discrete lens cap, and of course one tends to lose it. And indeed, when I bought this camcorder used, it didn't come with one. I really wonder why they didn't put in some sort of an integrated lens cap. It's a simple thing, but it's so convenient, and you can sort of see here I'm having a hard time putting the lens cap in. I'm not going to worry about it right now. The only thing I can think of is the larger size of the actual lens of the actual glass made it harder to have an integrated lens cover in the camcorder. The old camcorder came with a supplied shotgun microphone. The new camcorder, I had to purchase my own. I suspect it was sort of a combination of things. One, by not having a shotgun mic included, they could save about $100 and reduce the price of the camcorder a bit, probably making it more competitive and perhaps resulting in camcorders being sold that otherwise wouldn't. And the other thing is, I suspect many people decided that the included shotgun mic wasn't of the type that they would prefer for their applications, and went out and bought their own shotgun mic and replaced the included one anyway. So there was probably a combination of reasons for that, and you can see the one I've selected is indeed a little bit longer than the supplied one in the original camcorder, and essentially it means the one that I bought is a little bit more directional. And finally, the surprising difference is the old camcorder had a nice, easily visible tally light right up front here. And that's really important when you're doing your own videos, because it's very comforting to see that light nice and red and know you're capturing video. Well, on this camcorder, the tally light is up here and it's only barely raised, and there's also one down here. And the problem is you can't see either one of them nearly as well as you can on the original camcorder. And I'm a bit surprised that they did that. It certainly looks like there's space here, but for whatever reason, it isn't there, and that is too bad. None of those issues, of course, are game changers. It's just, it's sort of too bad when the older one had a few things that I really liked that the new one doesn't. Okay, a few other things I should point out about this camcorder that are worth mentioning. Perhaps the first one is the fact that it has a built-in fan, as do many 4K camcorders. And the fan is there to take away the heat from all that electronics that's needed to process and compress the 4K into manageable file sizes. The thing itself is not very noisy, so that's not the issue, and it also only comes on when needed. Think I've had it go on or noticed it maybe once when I had the camcorder just going for a really long time. The bigger concern that I have, as with any fan, is there is a certain amount of running time before it needs to be cleaned, serviced, replaced, and indeed there's actually a counter in one of the menus that tells you how long it's been running, and I believe gives you an indication when it should be serviced. Not a big deal, and I doubt it's too expensive to get serviced, but it's still sort of an added nuisance. The nice thing about the old one is with no moving parts, well, other than some of the controls, it's probably going to last forever until you drop it. This one, it does have a certain maintenance interval. From a video standpoint, the image sensor on the new camcorder is bigger than the old one, but they're still considered to be small sensors. And where does that factor in? Well, the thing that I really like about small sensors is with a small sensor you get a much larger depth of field when you're focusing in on something. And that's really important for me because I tend to get a little bit sloppy when I'm doing some experiment, and my attention is really more focused on the experiment than on focusing the camera, no pun intended. But if you have a larger sensor, you have to be more careful with the focusing, or your subject won't be in that crystal clear focus. And, well, I'm just happier to be able to be just a little bit sloppier in terms of focusing, and that really applies to my needs for a camcorder. Now, other users will think quite differently, namely cinematographers who want to do all sorts of beautiful photographic effects where they're zoomed in on one subject and somebody is in the distance background, and then, well, they adjust the focus slowly and the main subject who's talking about somebody else goes out of focus, and the person in the background who they're talking about comes into crystal clear focus. Well, that's all very important for cinematographers. That's not important for me. So that's the type of person that would also have a problem with the small sensor, because they'd really prefer a big sensor with a much narrower depth of field. A consequence of the small sensors, in particular compared to some similar camcorders, is other people have reported that these camcorders are less sensitive to light, and in particular don't work as well in low light conditions as, well, some of their competitors. Now, I've never found any sort of problem with the amount of light needed. I typically work in a normally or perhaps brightly lit workshop, and I've done some shooting around the house in normal lighting conditions or even dim, and even with the gains cranked up to 6 or 12 dBs, the amount of extra noise is minimal. Now, one of the complaints is, well, if it's late at night and you're trying to do some shooting, you do get a lot of noise, particularly if you go in the low lux mode that these things offer. Well, my feeling is, what are you trying to do at night? If you need so much gain, you want to make it look like daylight. I far prefer night shots where, well, the bulk of the shot is dark and the lights you get are the beautiful lights from neon signs and car headlights and, well, other illuminated things. You don't want everything to look like daylight. So I don't consider it a problem, but it is something worth noting. I actually get kind of interested in how sensitive these two camera sensors were, and I did a whole video on measuring them. And this was from the perspective of a still photographer. It turns out that the new camcorder has a sensitivity of about ISO 125, and when I say that, I mean for 0 dB gain, in other words, noiseless operation. And for the old camcorder, it has a sensitivity of ISO 64, again for 0 dB gain and noiseless operation. Now, that might sound like fairly low speeds, particularly compared to many of the modern DSLRs, but when you consider that these camcorders take video at a rate of about 30 frames per second, the typical shutter speed is 1/30th of a second, generally way longer than you would do with a DSLR. So you get an amazing amount of light landing on the sensor just because of the relatively long shutter speed. And for that reason, these types of sensitivities, I think, are more than adequate, in fact, very good for this type of application, and I certainly have no complaints. One really nice feature that the new camcorder has is a histogram of the video brightnesses, and that can be invaluable for setting the iris and shutter speed manually for an optimal picture. The older camcorder uses the very common zebra stripe method, where zebra stripes are displayed on the image when it is beyond a certain brightness, either in saturation or maybe at 80% of normal image. And that works very well too. The histogram just gives you way more information about the lighting situation in the scene. So that is a fabulous feature that this camcorder has. Unfortunately, the other important feature that both of them have is a audio meter, so you can see that you are capturing audio and whether it is loud enough, and you get a nice little bar graph showing, well, what the current audio levels are. Unfortunately, on this camcorder, you can only see that, or you can see the histogram, but you can't see both at the same time. I really wish I could see both of them in the viewfinder at the same time. And yes, it would take up a lot of image real estate, but I would still prefer it. As it is, I have to go in and press a button to switch from displaying one or the other. So I typically turn on the audio level meter when I'm setting up and doing a microphone check, and then switch to histogram for the rest of the video recording and hope the audio is still good. The other unfortunate thing is, I did mention how this new camcorder allows remote control from something like a cell phone. Well, you can't see either the audio levels or the histogram on the remote interface. At least I couldn't find it, and that's really too bad because that would be so useful as well. Now, to be able to use that remote interface, you have to connect your cell phone or computer or tablet or something else to the camcorder, and to do that, it has a USB connector that you can attach a Wi-Fi USB adapter or an Ethernet adapter or a cellular adapter, and get internet or at least network connectivity that way. Now, the unfortunate thing is only certain chipsets in these adapters are compatible with the camera, and it's really not JVC's problem, but there is a continual churning of available adapters and chipsets in the consumer market, and it took me quite a while to find one that I find good for my application. And in particular, I wanted one of these adapters that not only did 5.8 gigahertz, but also did not have a great big antenna sticking up, which I felt was just something asking to be broken off. So I had to do quite a bit of experimentation. JVC does try and provide an updated list of acceptable adapters, but they can be hard to find at times. The other reason for using one of these adapters is, of course, streaming, and that is, of course, one of the fabulous features of this particular camcorder, and I believe many people on YouTube and Facebook have bought the camera for that reason. And although I haven't tried doing that, I guess what you can do is directly connect this thing to either of those platforms and immediately start streaming. And well, that certainly is a great feature if you do that sort of thing, and who knows, maybe I will in the future. The reason I got this particular camcorder that had that feature was, well, because I saw a sale on a used camcorder and the price was almost unbeatable, so I jumped at it. Now, if you're not so lucky, you can get some similar models of camcorder. JVC makes the 180U and 170U, which are essentially the same device without the streaming. And the, I guess, 170U is also lacking the SDI video port, which is a video standard that could be used to connect this camcorder to a digital switcher in a studio. In most cases, people wouldn't need that feature, so the 170U or 180U might be the better choice and would certainly offer a significant price saving. And indeed, I would have gone for either one of those had I not come across this particular one. I should also point out that there are a number of specialized variants of the 250U. There is a sports variant that includes the ability to put in a title or other information graphic at the bottom of the screen and to somehow integrate that with a separate score entry device so that, well, the output of this camera can be showing what game you're recording and what the current score is, essentially eliminating the need for any sort of fancy and expensive switching gear that might be needed to otherwise integrate graphics and video. So this would be perfect for a school or a college or a local cable channel who might want to cover a local sports game. There's also the house of worship variant, in other words, the church variant of this camera. And indeed, this one actually is the church variant that has that same sort of captioning, titling built-in software, although obviously it doesn't have any of the score keeping stuff. And, well, I can certainly see how for that sort of application, or maybe if you were televising a town council, it could be very, very useful. The reason I got the house of worship one is not because I'm a church, and I wish I was for tax purposes, but I'm not. It was because that happened to be the one they sent me when I bought this camcorder used. And, well, it really has no detrimental effect, so it doesn't bother me at all. Obviously, for the house of worship or the sports version, you end up paying a bit of a premium, but it could be a huge saving if that's the type of thing that you intend to be doing with the camcorder. Now, why would you spend anywhere from $500 to a few $1,000 for a camcorder like this when you could just as easily use your phone or perhaps a DSLR or one of those new mirrorless cameras? Well, perhaps the biggest advantage these things offer is the convenience of all the manual controls. And I've gotten a taste of how convenient they are because I'm recording this video with my cell phone, and it is a considerable nuisance to have to go up and try and turn on the video recording application when I'm, well, making this video and when I want to stop. And the worst part is there's nothing on the cell phone that's indicating to me that it is actually recording. And so if it's not, well, you're not going to see this particular take, which will be, well, a real nuisance for me. The other thing is, of course, the ability to hook in all sorts of pro microphones. That can be extremely useful. And, of course, the fact that these things can store very high quality, high bitrate video, which if you're going to be doing all sorts of fancy editing is also very important. Less so for someone just shooting a quick video with their cell phone. Having said that, there are plenty of YouTube channels way bigger and more successful than mine who do all their shooting with cell phones, and depending on your application, a cell phone can be a better choice. And what I'm really thinking of is somebody who's walking around and telling a story or commenting on something. Well, there's nothing easier than doing that with a cell phone at the end of a selfie stick. So everything has its purpose, and the same thing with DSLRs. DSLRs are designed for still photography, yet pretty much all of them these days provide video abilities. I find just the format, the ergonomics of the camera are not well suited for video, and certainly it's virtually impossible, at least with some of them, to do a nice slow zoom in. The one thing that I find DSLRs excel at for video is operating in the dark, because in spite of what people might say about one camcorder or another, DSLRs are absolutely incredible in terms of low light performance. And indeed, in one of my previous videos, I used the DSLR to, well, take a video of some electrical corona discharge, which is so dim it's almost invisible even to the eye. And after capturing it with the DSLR, well, you would think it's as bright as a neon light. So again, everything has its application, and which you pick depends on what you're doing with it, and for that matter, whether you can splurge and spend a couple of $1,000 on this or $500 on this. Now, you might be wondering, would I recommend either of these cameras? And the answer is I wholeheartedly would, and I would highly recommend both of them. I would recommend the 100U, the GY-HM100U, for someone who wants to see what it's like using a professional camcorder, and certainly the image quality and the HD output is absolutely good enough for just about anything on YouTube these days, and it would certainly be a very inexpensive way of trying out professional camcorders and seeing if all the manual controls and the ability to hook in professional microphones is worthwhile for you and works for you. And if it does, well, then I would suggest looking at something like this 4K camcorder. Well, this one from JVC or one from any of the other major manufacturers like Canon or Panasonic or Sony. And to me, the biggest motivation for 4K was to essentially future-proof my videos. Although the truth of the matter is, a lot of video viewing is not done on 4K these days. And even when it is, the screens are so small that you really can't see the 4K in all of its glory anyway. So it's really not that critical, in my opinion. It's sort of a nice bonus. Now, from an editing standpoint, 4K is really wonderful because, well, if you want to maybe zoom in a bit electronically in your favorite video editor, if you're doing that with a 4K image, you can certainly zoom in quite a bit without a significant deterioration in image quality. And I often do that to sort of correct the positioning of myself or my subject. And 4K really is a luxury when you're doing that. So that's my little review and comparison of these two camcorders and the similar ones to this, namely the 170 and 180U camcorders from JVC. I hope you found it useful, and I hope it's useful even if you're not going to buy one of these two camcorders but are looking at camcorders and trying to figure out what features are important and what aren't. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and see you next time.